Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for an overview of research use cases for software collections. This is a topic that I'm really excited about as someone who works directly with record creators, because I feel like it makes a great kind of advocacy case, not just about the problems if you can't continue to access digital records, but the specific potential and excitement about what you can do with digital records. And I feel like that is an important first step in getting buy-in with stakeholders kind of beyond the LIS practitioner world. So yeah, but first kind of let's take a step back and thinking about this question that a lot of sectors of the cultural heritage sector and beyond are digging into today, which is how can archival practices best adapt to serve digital collections? One such approach that I've found useful to frame my own thinking and encourages a more radical rethinking of archival practices, and also really considers the unique possibilities of this moment is collections as data, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This IMLS-supported effort creates a framework and a set of deliverables that guide cultural heritage professionals in the development, description, and provisioning of collections that are amenable to computational analysis. Since 2016, Collections as Data has hosted 2 national forums, the second of which wrapped up yesterday, and some of which was recorded and is available to watch online. And I'll drop the links in the chat box in just a moment. Along with, they also collect and develop use cases, host project workshops at a wide variety of conferences, and continue to dig into both the technical and social potential possibilities and the issues that come up in dealing with digital collections. So collection as data is a strategy that approaches digital collections not simply with traditional archival modes, but encourages reconceptualizing archival practices holistically by coming to those collections on their own terms as digital objects. And let me just send you guys the links to their website, and then their second forum that was just this week in a nice bit of serendipitous timing. As Thomas Padilla, the principal investigator of the Collections as Data initiative and the visiting digital research services librarian at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, wrote in his 2016 paper on a Collections as Data imperative, data are defined as ordered information stored digitally that are amenable to computation. In thinking about our collections, if the notion of a single digitized text is shifted from a surrogate of a bound paper object to consider the possibility latent in a form that is computationally processable at the level of thousands or even millions of texts, a move is made toward meaning making that engages affordances unique to data. When a tweet, website, or work of electronic literature is examined, what interlocking standards and structures can be discerned beneath the representation seen on screen? How might these standards and structures be traversed computationally to gain a better understanding of networks of meaning built daily across time, space, and language? When art is explored as data, what computational tools are available to aid eyes and minds in the assessment of hue, saturation, light, darkness, intention, and style? And sorry, I know that is kind of a long quote, but he talks so beautifully about the potential of digital collections and in a way that really makes me excited. So I would encourage you to check out his writing and the resources available from Collections as Data if you have not already. And in thinking about this approach, one example I like, which I'll also drop the link to in the chat box, is the CooperHewitt Collection, their digital collections catalog. So shifting our thinking about digital records away from as surrogates for physical records opens up potential use cases in digital scholarship. How can we steward collections in a way that invites scholars to dig into the data in new and innovative ways? This is a mindset that encourages experimentation and play in considering collection management. So if you look at the CooperHewitt Collections portal, in addition to more traditional access points, you can browse by color, concordance, departments, exhibitions, things a little more specific to the sort of objects that they have in their collection. And this is kind of on a basic level, the sort of possibilities opened up by thinking about collections as digital objects, as like collections of bytes and bits that can be interacted with computationally. But just as someone who does work with designers, like the idea of browsing by color is always one of the first things that comes up. So just even that really basic new kind of way to interact with collections is really exciting. And there is so much more possible digitally in that way. What are those other unique opportunities afforded by digital collections, and how can we use examples of these opportunities to get users and stakeholders excited about what is possible? So yeah, and CooperHewitt also has this experimental page where there are kind of ways to interact with the collection that you can enable yourself that aren't part of the default portal that I'll also drop the link in the chat box. It's also just an example of kind of, even just in terms of collection management and access, like expanding or thinking about it in a more kind of playful and exploratory way, and what can result from those experiments. So looking at collections, as data also understands digital records as being deeper than the surface level product. To quote Padilla again, a Word document is not just a document. A website is not just a projection on a screen, and a tweet is much more than 140 characters. To preserve the whole of a digital record requires more than a single file, but the context and environment that produces it. This leads us back directly to software preservation, because, of course, software is that context and environment. In addition to being its own collection of data with its own unique challenges. And when considering digital collections in this light, this approach opens up conversations in scholarship that go beyond even just expanded access. How does the capacities and limitations of the software shape the records they produced? And what does research look like that engages with that question? So luckily, we have two people with us doing work that digs right into these issues. So with that, I'll go ahead and transition to the panel discussion and introduce our two guests. So Matthew Allen is a lecturer at the University of Toronto and a PhD candidate at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Matthew's current research focuses on the history of computer use by architects, particularly in the 1960s. He has curated exhibitions and written on the history of programming, the development of architectural software, and digital aesthetics. He has recently lectured on the history and present use of screenshots, the preservation and archaeology of digital architecture, and the post-medium condition. Matthew's writing has been published in Log, Perspectives on Science, Harvard Design Magazine, and the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, and many other venues. So thank you, Matthew, for being with us. And then we also have Eric Kaltman, who is a Clear Fellow for Data Curation in the Sciences at Carnegie Mellon University, where he focuses on software and computer game preservation and ontology and knowledge engineering for software historical resources. Prior to that, he was a member of the Preserving Virtual Worlds 2 project team, which investigated archivally significant properties for computer games, and a project manager for game metadata and citation project. From 2008 to 2012, he was a project archivist for the Digital Games Collections at Stanford University, cataloging and archiving the Cabrinetti Collection and Steve Moretsky's Infocom papers. He has a PhD in computer science from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he worked on solutions for software preservation and software history, including metadata, library systems, emulation, and basic natural language processing for historical revelations. He previously worked in the video game and software development industries. So thank you, Matthew and Eric, for being here today. And so our first, let me go back to the discussion section slide, but our first question is just how software factors into your research. So maybe if we can start with Eric, if you want to give a background into your research and how software factors in, and how maybe software kind of as data or as a research object is part of your work.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me here. This is totally cool. So my dissertation research was on basically the full pipeline for how to kind of collect and document the records of software development, and then on the other end, how to actually show and illuminate those records through emulation and other sorts of systems in that way. My basic history on this project, on this transient, was that I was working at Stanford about a decade ago on their software collection, and there was basically no apparatus to deal with those collections, from anything from library standards to any kind of, cataloging and that type of thing. So my immediate research now is in, the most recent project I did was a front-end emulation management system for JavaScript emulations of computer games to help cite them. And I also am now working with 2 colleagues on basically programming languages to analyze collections of game data to see if we can do like much easier reverse engineering for potential future scholars. There's a whole lot of other stuff I'll probably get to in that purview.
Okay, no, very cool, and a good intro. So Matthew, then, if you can also give sort of a background on how software factors into your research.
Okay. So there are basically 2 ways. Well, first of all, I'll say that I'm just learning about this collections as data sort of effort, and I'm fully kind of on board with it. But I guess as you'll see, most of the research I do is not using data in a particularly sort of computationally intensive or weird way. Anyway, the first way I use software is to access historical architectural data. So if I'm doing research on an architect in the 1990s, I might want to look at their digital models or drawings. And so then I need old versions of software just to be able to open it. So that's the most normal basic way I use software. Sometimes though I take software itself, the software that architects were using, as the object of my research, and this tends to be kind of much more unusual or focused projects. So I'm doing a study right now on the visual defaults of software and how they change the types of drawings that architects are doing. So, for example, there's a piece of software called Rhinoceros 3D that a lot of architects have used in the last 20 years that has a particular kind of grayscale scheme, and so in a certain lighting characteristics of the modeling, etc. And so looking at drawings that architects are producing and kind of seeing how these visual defaults are sort of seeping into the ways that these architects are thinking about architecture. Another study I'm doing is how the evolution of software changes design practices, particularly how, like if new commands are sort of put into software, how architects begin to take up these commands and incorporate them into their ways of working. And again, they're ultimately their ways of thinking about architecture. Now, obviously, these two ways of using software, using it to access historical data and then looking at the software itself, they tend to blur together. So when I'm like opening an old model, I usually want to see it the way that the architect saw it. So how the software itself is configured is very important. So using it as an access tool and using it, or and looking at the software itself, often goes together, or I want it to as a historian, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Have you, so are you able to, have you had like encountered difficulties kind of getting at those older files, sort of, and being able to view them as the architects did at the time, or what does that process look like?
Well, yeah, so I mean, definitely some difficulties. Most of the, well, okay, I'll say that there are two areas that I'm researching. One is sort of mid 90s to the present, and you know, at that point I can often find old installation media for software, and I can run an emulator of, you know, Windows, whatever, and I can pretty closely reproduce it, you know, without too much trouble, actually. Um, on the other hand, I'm looking at some software in the 60s, which is extremely difficult. You know, I can find source code in Fortran, but, you know, having any, you know, entering it in is one thing, compiling it, running it is another thing. But then, you know, the environment of using it is just radically different. You know, looking at it on a laptop versus whatever terminal it was being looked at in the 60s. So, you know, sometimes it's almost impossible. Sometimes it's pretty easy, I guess.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So those are both very interesting areas of research, and thank you for the background. So for the next question, maybe Eric can talk about what the unique qualities the software you're studying has kind of as a research object, if you have any thoughts about that question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the area of, I've worked in lots of different areas of computer games specifically. And some of them are, I guess I'd refer them as like highly contingent on other systems and infrastructures to work. So a lot of the work that we had done early on like preservation of virtual worlds and such, requires, you know, kind of an active community to be engaged with the software and a bunch of network services that we don't have access to now. So if you want to, I guess as Matt was talking about, like recreating the context for some of these earlier games and systems, it's just not really possible without, well, it's not really possible. And if you want to actually do good work on it, you need to make sure that there's just some sort of documentation and like paratextual stuff around it. So like videos and like written works and documentation that would be actually more commensurate with like previous forms of historical investigation. The other thing with this is that due to the fact that the software I work with is also like compiled, and I'm looking at technical implementation details, you need to get into a lot of like direct reverse engineering and other fields involved in like computer science, investigative, and forensics. That is not something that I would encounter, I think, with doing text mining or some of the other types of data sets that we've messed with. So software is kind of occluded in weird ways that are not the same with some other types of data.
Okay. Have you, so can you speak at all a little more to kind of the difficulties of accessing the software you use in your research, or I don't know, difficulties or ways in which maybe it was easier than you thought?
So I guess being in video games is actually a lot, I think, easier than other areas of software historical study, due to the fact that the community is so, I guess, like active, especially for more popular older systems. So for the work that I do that we did with like emulation management and kind of citing emulated states and trying to help game scholars understand how to like get people to specific locations and running programs, all of the hardest technical work was not done by us because someone had already written an emulator, someone had already partially compiled it to JavaScript. And then other people had actually written full programs that do indexing for older systems and stuff. So if you want to study like older Nintendo games, there's a canonical database file that is shared amongst the community that has a record of every known variant of every possible Nintendo game that has ever existed, both that's created by companies and by any fan. And so there's all these tools that are immediately available to do historical research with that kind of exist outside of the normal like scholarly channels, just because people are so interested in this old stuff.
Yeah, no, that's something that is really interesting to me as someone who's coming from somewhere else, a sort of like hobbyist community in video game preservation, and how much power that has. Are there, in thinking about that though, do you encounter any kind of like issues with kind of on the legal side, or
yeah, I mean, we just kind of ignore them for right now.
Yeah.
Like for the work that I was doing recently with emulations in JavaScript, you obviously like need to have game data to run. And so we'll just get that to do analysis on it and not but then can't disseminate it in that way, which is kind of an issue with some of this work. Is that if we're doing analysis on a specific game and you need it to be like analyzing the actual runtime of the system and like showing that to people, sharing that is actually kind of technically also sharing the game. So we're still dealing with like how to actually figure that out, if there's ways to do stuff technologically for that specific type of analysis. For other systems that do like emulation on cloud services, I think that's kind of being worked out. But it's still kind of early fraught process. Yeah,
I can imagine. Is there any kind of, I mean, do the companies like, I don't know, is this on their radar in any way, or?
Some of the companies really against it. Nintendo is notorious for going after this type of thing. And then some smaller companies are totally fine. Like when we were doing work with Stanford, we got like blanket permission from some smaller companies to just use their image data for whatever. But those are usually like older games that people are not as interested in, and the creators are like much more on board with this type of thing. And it's becoming a harder issue now because the like retro game industry to like run games in emulation and resell them is now like hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And so there's a bunch of players in that space who are buying up basically all of the outmoded IPs that like are just hanging around, and then we'll probably start protecting them again for potential resale, because you can kind of keep playing these things into the future. So I'm expecting that to kind of have a much bigger, like that become a much bigger problem in the next little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I guess both as emulation like is an exciting opportunity, but then what does that mean in terms of keeping those things alive and financially viable, I guess. Yeah, the next question, which is, do you think that the practice of creating and writing software is a requirement for the study of software as a research object? Matthew, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say it depends on the audience quite a lot. I mean, as a historian or a cultural critic, I'm usually trying to bridge between, or I'm trying to write for a sort of popular audience and kind of bridge to a more technical audience of some, or a more technical historical body of knowledge of some kind, whether it's software development or the production of architecture. And so the knowing how it operates behind the scene is, I mean, like probably totally crucial in order to really, be able to give some insight into that to, to everybody else. But I would say especially in my experience, especially in the computation community, it can also be a kind of liability, because it can be very alienating to start talking about code or something all of a sudden. For if you're writing for somebody who doesn't know that stuff, it can really turn their brain off when they're sort of thrust into that world, I suppose. Yeah,
I can imagine. Eric, do you feel like the practice of creating and writing software should be a requirement, or about that question?
Yeah, I don't know if should would not be an operative word there.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, yes and no, I guess, and echoing what Matt said, depending on the context of what you're trying to investigate. There's a big issue in the work that I do for like kind of following the technical development of systems and how you actually, again, as was just stated, like share that with a non-technical audience. And I think a lot of the software historical work kind of suffers from trying to figure out how to play to both sides, because sometimes you'll need to get into significant like technical nuance to understand and explain why something is important. But then you kind of lose people. Another issue that I've encountered with this as well is that if you want to do like significant reverse engineering, technical understanding, and forensic analysis of this type of stuff, and you have a background in software development, there's a big pull to just go to software development and leave the history. And so I know a lot of people in games specifically are, you know, full-time developers, and then on their side they do these like investigations of technical systems, but they're not historians. And so there's this like fervent work to explain how something works technically, but then not to connect to any sort of critical historical trends and that type of thing. And so there's that type of gap as well. Like there's a lot of people who are doing what I would consider to be software history, but they're just, you know, interested developers, and they're not kind of, you know, engaged with any sort of the critical aspects of it. It's just like, oh, this thing was nifty and here's how it worked. And I guess if you want to understand something, you have to get yourself up to the specific level of technical depth to answer the question that you're investigating. So for, you know, certain things that I do, yes, knowing how the architecture of an older system worked is very important. But if I'm looking at, you know, how user interface effects like evolved or that type of thing, you may not need to actually get as deep. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, people need the time to get into it at that level, and if they're being pulled away, that's not going to happen. I do want to say, because there's about 15 minutes until the end of until our end time, that if anyone in the audience has questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat box, and we'll pose them to the panel as we get close to wrapping up. So feel free to shoot those to the group. Yeah, I also, so just thinking about the last question is, which collections as data documentary methods have the greatest impact potential for software preservation efforts? I don't know if either of you got a chance to kind of dig into what collections as data is doing, but maybe just like thinking about collections broadly as digital objects. Is there any avenues of potential or like specific to digital collections that you see as exciting in terms of their potential impact, or what can be done with them? What can be done with them in research? Does that make sense? Just what about a digital? What kind of specific potential digital objects have that is exciting in thinking about research in this light? Maybe Eric, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I looked over some of the collections as data stuff beforehand, and for my, I guess, immediate like work at Carnegie Mellon and data curation stuff, the facets were pretty useful in that it's full implementation details for how you would set up and do certain actions around specific types of preservation activity, which is always kind of a difficult thing to get traction and convince people like interinstitutionally and internally about what like required, what resources are needed to actually get certain things done, especially with like software specifically, because it gets so complex. And then I'm kind of really excited about some of the new like emulation management solution stuff that's coming out, like the Easy project at EL for emulation nodes. And then there's the video game preservation community right now is going through trying to create a unified index of all the software collections that we know is held at different institutions. that would eventually probably be linked to being able to run them like by click-through in the browser at some point. Obviously, there's a ton of IP and legal stuff involved with that. But I think the notion that you'll be able to access pre-configured older environments will be really, really useful for helping people study this stuff in the future. That said, as Matt mentioned way earlier, that's only one context. If you're running it on your laptop in an emulator, it's not the historical context that that thing was actually existing in. And so there'll only be certain types of studies that this makes possible, but I think it'll be a lot better for the general field of the history of software if there's just much more availability of older software to investigate. Yeah, so I'll leave it there and then respond if there's questions or comments.
Okay.
I'll jump in here and say I thought the position statements were the most useful in a couple of different ways. In my own field, it's you know, the stuff being preserved is sort of scattered around kind of randomly, and it's just hard to know what is where. And just sort of seeing these cases, you know, I've actually found stuff that I could use in the future, and you know, new ways of using things. But you know, I mean, so as a user, it's helpful in that way. But I think on the other side, the kind of impact potential for software preservation efforts, or if the bigger issue is how to structure collections to encourage new and innovative ways of using them, you know, I think these use cases are of collections as data are kind of as a whole make a really great case for. I mean, doing just that, to, you know, the making data, collections of data of different types available to users in a, let's say, a relatively unstructured format, or a kind of, you know, I'm as a historian, I'm used to like digging through files, and you know, like thinking about physical files, piles of paper, right? Like I love kind of the forensic work of just kind of having a bunch of stuff and kind of going through it. And like my dream would be if libraries, different institutions, you know, took in just sort of piles of data from architects and just sort of like handed it over to me. And, you know, and then let me, in the end, I might just be opening it in Windows Explorer and kind of clicking through the folders. But, you know, that kind of, you know, I mean, it seems like a huge paradigm shift in a way, because it totally changes what librarians would be doing or archivists would be doing. They're not sort of going through and sorting things and structuring things and representing it through a web browser or something. They're just sort of taking in a pile and giving you the pile. Makes everything really easy. I mean, so I think that's the, you know, potentially in the end, the biggest impact that could come from this, rethinking, you know, what these collections are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But, and then like the different kind of challenges that comes with just like a pile of data as opposed to a more, yeah.
Getting back to one of the earlier questions, I think the biggest issue, or the most unique issue in this field, and it's especially with software, is the legal issues. Once you start trying to, you know, figure out what's possible, you have, you know, who knows how many different sort of rights holders that you have to negotiate with. There's I mean, for me, it's also very unique in that the other type of data I use, images and so on, is covered just sort of broadly by fair use. I can sort of generally use a lot of things in a lot of different ways without really worrying about that. And yeah, if there were an analogous thing in software, I'd be happy.
Yeah, no, and I think, yeah, the legal, it's interesting to me, like the two areas you come from, because I do feel like in architecture, that is such a big issue, is the vendors and how proprietary the software is. But in thinking about those kind of big piles of data, we do have a question from Paul, who is interested if you have any thoughts about collecting policies. So what in those like big piles that are coming in that should be kept if things are reconceptualized in these ways. Do either of you have thoughts about how that can be thought about in different terms, like what should be collected? Because I think in a dream world, maybe everything would be the answer, but that's probably unrealistic.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually done work a couple years ago with the NEH on, I guess, appraisal strategies for documentation of like research computer games or games made for academic research purposes, and kind of just going through like what in that pile was actually be useful and like what the uses for those different facets are. As far as someone who does history in this, obviously you want to try and save as much as possible. I think the thing to say about the collecting policies is that the documentation around the software object is like as important, and in some cases like more important than actually having the software that you can run, which is becoming more and more apparent in the games community for like what aspect of having videos of performances is versus actually being able to run the game yourself. I would also, for software history specifically, there's a lot of stuff that kind of gets swept out thinking because of this like focus we have on technical obsolescence and such. And so specifically here at Carnegie Mellon, they do a lot of, purges of older books that have a ton of documentation about how older systems and software that are no longer used were organized. And that's because the current people here don't need to use it for their current research, and the current classes don't kind of focus on that. But a ton of that older information will be very important if we need to figure out how the older systems ran and re-architecting them. I do work with the technical infrastructure group of Software Reservation Network, and the emulator designer on that team talked about the fact that the main thing that prevents emulations from happening is lack of documentation. And that the stronger documentation you have, the better chance you have of actually resurrecting anything. So yeah, I don't have much more on explicit collecting policy in that case, except to like make sure that there's also some focus on all of the secondary documentation and not just a focus on getting the image. Because for doing the work that I do, like a lot of the secondary documentation is absolutely necessary to understanding how to even use that thing.
Yeah, I think, and as someone who's kind of embedded with record creators, I feel like, even their own files, just like as the volume of digital objects grows and grows, and if you're in an environment where you're working collaboratively on things, just like encouraging as much of a paper trail as possible is a big challenge, and would be helpful down the line.
Just to chime in here, I would like to think that it's possible just to take everything, actually. And, the nice thing about digital stuff is that you could, it depends on how you think about it, I suppose. If you're sort of sorting through file by file and sort of appraising each thing initially, then, you have to make choices. But what if you thought, okay, I'm taking this external hard drive with data from an architect, right? Which some institutions do, right? And they get this, and surely they're saving it, right? Surely they're backing it up, right? And then they're making choices about what they can present more publicly. But, because they have the pile of data, they could also in the future change that, right? I would think even from a content creator point of view, one little pilot project I've been trying to do with architecture students is to have them at the end of a semester do a snapshot of their computer in such a way that it saves everything that they have and their working environment, and the software to open everything. such that it can be opened later in an emulator, right? It actually almost makes projects kind of self-documenting. I mean, there are huge kind of privacy issues, right? If you can open somebody's email and kind of figure out the context of a project. But, you know, on the other hand, you can be pretty sure that like you're getting everything that's important. I would say having the mindset of just taking the pile initially, and then you know, whether that kind of goes into a vault that kind of nobody gets to see until it's dealt with, or whatever, deal with that later maybe. But you know, I don't see why all these choices need to be made quite, you know, up front, or you know.
Yeah, so immediately. Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I don't know. There are also just like technical challenges to saving everything, especially, I mean, I've found working in a firm, just the amount of data that's produced is so large, and it's only seems to be growing larger for whatever reason. But yeah, no, thinking about when and how those choices are made is certainly interesting. And we have another question from Paul, which is, given the importance of the contextual information and documentation that Eric mentioned, I was wondering how much you guys utilize or rely on web archives for your research, or is that stuff all on paper or floppies in a cupboard somewhere waiting to be thrown away? So I guess how you get that documentation. Do either of you?
Yeah, just one small thing. One project I did was looking at the history of this Rhinoceros 3D software, and when different commands were added into the software, and I knew that a sort of change log was available for the software because I looked at it before on their website. And early on in this project, I tried to get a hold of McNeil, who made the software, and to get the change log from them. And that, you know, sure enough, they said no. But I ended up, just going to the Wayback Machine on archive.org, and you know, actually their change logs were pretty consistently kept on the same, you know, web page for about 20 years, and so I could just go through and copy and paste, and I had you know, a pretty representative 20-year sort of change log from that.
I guess for this specific example, I was doing some work on, Stanford has the original source code for the multi-user dungeon, the first like effective multiplayer online computer game. But the problem is that even though we have all the source code, it was written in BCPL, which is a non-standardized language that was used at the university it was made in the, you know, 70s, late 70s to early 80s. And so just parsing that required finding online documented scans of like the manuals that were being used at the university at the time to explain the language. And then I actually managed to, the web was useful because some enthusiasts had actually written like full descriptions of how the actual specific MUD engine did its processing. And that was really useful to have. And that was also preserved by the Internet Archive because the site I was actually looking at during my research went offline, like in the middle of doing that research. So like the website did like effectively disappeared from the public internet while I was in the middle of you know, taking information off of it. So, I mean, the web archives definitely become important, and that's like another way that the contextual documentation is necessary, because if I have a undocumented programming language that I'm trying to figure out how it works and even like rewrite a compiler for or something, it's incredibly hard, next to impossible, to reverse engineer that with just the code. So that's like another just note on how the documentation floating around online is really useful in a lot of these cases.
Yeah, those are great examples. I don't know, and thinking about kind of contextual documentation, and in terms of just like interacting with sort of raw piles of data. I mean, when you're parsing through that, is there any kind of I don't know, I'm thinking about the challenges of like getting a big dump of files and maybe not knowing, like wishing to have some sort of mediation by the creators of the records? I mean, is there any kind of like, have you encountered in your research any missing documentation you wish you could have had, thinking along those lines, or maybe you had the ability to interact with people directly, like how you get at those details that are missing?
I guess another quick example of that, I was doing work on the computer game Doom, and we have a relationship with John Romero who created it, and so he sent us just a dump of ID's, like the company that made the game, servers that existed in 1995, which was obviously not available to share outward. It was just for our research purposes. But having the person who developed the stuff available to answer sort of questions contextually about it was incredibly important. But the other notion, which was kind of hard, is that they didn't use any sort of software preservation or version control systems at that point in the early 90s. And so there's no like way to track any of the changes that happened. It's just a uniform snapshot at that specific time. And since it's an actual development server for a company, there's like multiple versions of the same file that may or may not be involved in the final compilation candidate. And so there's just a ton of development information that would be nice to have, or that if we could find ways to like automate locating those things, which is kind of what I'm working on as well, is just what I encounter as far as doing the parsing that I need to do, that like Matthew mentions, like, is there any sort of like automated tools that would help that easier if I could pull out specific versions of files, or like kind of automatically link things if it's in a programming language that we understand, that type of stuff. You know, is kind of really useful if it's available.
Yeah, I can think of a similar case where I was trying to sort of reconstruct how a building was designed, but it was designed in the early 2000s, and it was you know, very much how I would imagine ID's server being, just lots of kind of copies of what looks like the same thing. The only thing really differentiating them is the kind of timestamp on them. And so totally bewildering, but you know, luckily the architect was on hand to, you know, I guess graciously donated a bunch of his time to kind of go through the files and figure out what was happening along the way.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. It's, I guess, just trying to figure out, I mean, that won't always be possible. So how can you create a version of that data dump where maybe that information is in there, or tools to help move that along. So I think we've covered all our questions. Matthew or Eric, is there anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap up? No? Okay.
I mean, I have, just as a general thing from the last point, is that I have a feeling in talking with other people who do like investigative work in like my area of games and how that type of, you know, historical investigation, it feels like a lot of us are doing some things that are very similar methodologically that haven't been like teased out enough yet, as far as like what our actual scholarly process is and how it can actually be helped by the organization or things that can help organize the historical data about software. For instance, the emulation stuff that I had been doing was a lot of it was devoted to being able to run comparative emulations at the same time to see if some versions of a game are different and like what changed. And I showed this to a colleague of mine, and he was like, I wish I'd had this type of thing available when I wrote my book 2 years ago, because it would have saved me like weeks of work that I was doing for like getting these things running comparatively and doing types of stuff like that. So, I mean, I'm just interested in generally if there's people who are doing scholarship in this area, like what they kind of processes they're doing with the collections, you know, and how they're actually making use of the data and documentation, because I think there's a lot of overlap in like generalized solutions for specific types of parsing and representation.
Yeah, I'll second that. Just in the case of architectural history, one of the things that needs to be done, so I teach at a university, and you know, the way to start, sharing best practices is to, have a kind of digital methodology seminar or something like that for historians, or for different groups that might not, that will be using the data, but will be sort of left to their own devices without some kind of structure presented to them, in their educational process. So definitely for architectural historians, having, incorporating this stuff into the curriculum somehow is going to be kind of crucial in the next, X number of years.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think in terms of methodological sharing and like kind of cross-discipline conversations that I think we can learn from these kind of initiatives are really valuable. So yeah, thanks everyone. It was a pleasure being with you today. I don't know if Sarah, are you ready to wrap up?
Yeah, sure. And just to add, perhaps if there's anything that people want to follow up with after Matthew and Eric's discussion, they can always add it to the SPN or DPC websites in the comments on the page. So if there are kind of little working groups that can come out of this, perhaps that's the place to just sort of get in touch and say so. But I'll leave that to you. For now, I'll say thank you very much. Again, that was really, really great, really interesting. I learned a lot. The episode recording will be posted on the SPN and DPC website by the end of the week. Alongside, I think there'll be a few supplementary resources. Andy, is that right? You'll send those through, a few links and things that you've popped in the chat box as well. Everything that we referenced in today's discussion anyway, and we'll share that link by email and Twitter. And episode 4, software in digital/scholarly communications, will air at the same time next Wednesday with Elizabeth Park from McGill University as your research lead and facilitator. She'll be joined by James Howison from the University of Texas at Austin, Veronica Ikashoji-Orlati from Vanderbilt University, and Neil Chu Hong from the Software Sustainability Institute. And again, as Jess has said last week, once the whole series is over, we're going to distribute a little survey. So please do keep track of the topics that you'd like to hear more about, that you've liked hearing about, that you're interested in, but you think we could do more on, and tell us about that there. But just a final word to say thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.